Welcome to the Stay the Markets podcast. I'm Paul Rodriguez of thinktrading.com.
I'm Tim Price of pricevaluepartners.com.
And our very special guest is Graham Rowan.
Graham Rowan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Tim. Great to be here.
You've sent us a bio, but in your own words, would you like to introduce yourself for those of our listeners that may not know your name?
Yeah, certainly. Well, in recent years, I've mainly been involved in direct private equity, partly through running Inside Investor Club, which is a group of just under 200 high net worth investors that I spend my time looking for interesting investment opportunities for. But also more recently, I've been doing work with founders who need to raise capital because there's been a bit of a shift going on in the institutional side of things, that the VCs and private equity funds now really only look at companies that are worth 200 million plus. So any founders in the kind of 10 to 200 million range are being more or less forced to go to private investors. And they have a very different psychology, a different vocabulary, different priorities and timescales. So I'm helping founders to really position themselves as effectively as possible to raise from the private investor community.
Is this a reflection of the fact that market is primarily deemed, whether correctly or not, to be institutional, then it's not really for individual investors?
Well, I think, yeah, the institutions are certainly moving up market, if you like. They seem to have a less of an appetite for smaller companies, but that's actually creating a great opportunity because in the past, private investors were often really excluded and struggled to access some of these opportunities. And what I've found over the last 4 or 5 years is that the quality of companies that are coming to me looking to raise from private investors has gone up significantly because they seem to be excluded from the institutions. So it's actually proved to be a bit of a blessing for private investors that the institutions are only looking at the bigger companies.
And how did you get into this space?
Oh, just absolutely not by design. It just came along that we got involved in some alternative investments going back to not long after the GFC, I suppose, 2009-10. Initially with French property, then we got involved in other kinds of alternative investments, and then eventually it dawned on me that the real growth and the real value and the wealth was being created in privately held, relatively small and medium-sized companies. And it was a case of building my own personal network so that I could get access to these things, because the hardest challenge has been these things, by definition, remain private in certain circles, and you have to break into those circles to get the opportunities. So in the early days, I was running around, talking to anyone and everyone to try and find these things. And then thankfully, as I got a bit more experience and a bit more success, the founders have started coming to me. So I now have the opposite problem, that I probably get around between 100 and 120 opportunities a year. And I only put forward probably about 4 or 5 of them to my investors. So I have a lot of weeding out to do and a lot of due diligence to do.
In what areas are you finding the most innovation and requests for or perhaps the most interesting projects that you think would work or push forward? And have things changed in the last 10 years?
I think Paul basically wants you to stop talking about crypto here.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. It could be AI. It could be could be property. There's lots of things. Maybe even precious metals.
Yeah, well, firstly, we are very much sector agnostic, but there's always a tendency to look for things that have really interesting technology that can scale and that can, without sounding too twee about it, can, make the world a better place. So, for example, one of the companies I was excited to raise funds for is called Glint, and they have a what they've effectively done is to turn gold bullion into everyday money. So I have a Glint MasterCard. I have gold in the vault in Zurich, which is allocated in my own name. And I could go into Starbucks or Cafe Nero, order a cappuccino, and as I realized when I was in London last week, that will now cost me 5 of your English pounds. So I can then tap the terminal, and in 200 nanoseconds, it would sell 5 quid's worth of gold in Zurich, convert it to fiat, and the merchant is none the wiser. So effectively, I can avoid losing all the value of my money through currency debasement and inflation. I can hold it as gold right up to the point of purchase, at which point I transfer it back to pounds or dollars or whatever. So that was one example of an exciting development. I'm now working with another company that's doing the same thing for property, so that you could actually turn real estate into liquid funds at the touch of a button, kind of thing. So things like that I think are really exciting, and coming as I know Tim does from a sound money background, anything that allows people to invest in real world assets but still have liquidity to live day-to-day life, I find very exciting.
Does the Glint card pay any interest?
No, it doesn't pay interest, but I think there are people that have schemes where you can start to get a yield on gold, but you're then entering into an element of risk.
Because it strikes me that the only way you can do that is by lending it out.
Exactly. So that's not why I would use something like this. No. So Glint is very much, you buy the gold, it's in the Brinks vault in Zurich, and then you only change it to fiat when you
at the point of transacting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there's quite a few companies that are doing that, aren't there, at the moment? There's been a proliferation of them, I think, but there's for obvious reasons. But I just wanted to circle back slightly, because what I was asking is what sectors are you seeing more activity? You gave an example of one project, but what sort of sectors and general projects are you seeing, and how have they changed over the last 10 years?
Well, certainly, I'll come on to AI. Now, AI is such a lottery at the moment. I definitely did not want to propose or promote to my members a single AI company, because there are so many coming into the field. I remember watching a video of the Y Combinator people over there in Silicon Valley, and this was their kind of investment committee, and they were talking about all the latest exciting AI projects, and then they started referring to some that they'd invested in 6 months beforehand, as if they were kind of rancid yesterday's papers, and that really reinforced my concern. So with what we've done with AI is we've gone for a company that actually effectively is like a consultancy that goes into big corporations who frankly are way behind the curve with AI. They look at where the potential is there to use AI, and then they bring in any of their 75 partner companies to actually develop and implement the solutions. So they've now done something like 400 projects in real world companies. So by backing them, we're backing not just their own expertise, but all of that infrastructure they've got, all those partners they've got. And frankly, if one or two of them disappear without trace, it won't matter, because the rest of the structure is there. And they're now winning some very large projects to become the kind of AI office for big companies who aren't quite sure what to do with this amazing new technology. So obviously there's been huge amounts of hype around it. There's some pretty ridiculous valuations out there, but for real world benefits being delivered on a regular basis, that's the kind of company we went for. We've done fintech, we've done space, aerospace and defense, which are clearly becoming more relevant as the world's risk factors get somewhat higher day by day. And got a big space project we're doing at the moment. It's quite sort of top secret. I can't say too much about it, but that's going to be probably one of the biggest and most ambitious British projects in space that's about to launch. We've done a couple with VC in Singapore who's investing in growth in India. I was looking for how do we access all this good stuff that's happening in India, but avoid the kind of historic risks of governance and corruption and everything else. So we've gone for a Singapore-based VC that invests into Indian companies as a way of giving us
many lines. That is the...
Not sure what happened there.
Yes.
Black helicopters are getting involved, I think.
Yeah, no,
you said too much already, Graham.
No, sorry, that was my system. I was trying to shut a browser, and it started to play a YouTube video. I'm very sorry about that. So yeah, no, that's fascinating. And would you say that there's more capital now chasing projects than good projects?
I think it's difficult. You know, there's so much uncertainty, especially in the UK at the moment, that investors are nervous, and certainly this year has been more challenging than last year. And people inevitably will hang on to their money if there's uncertainty. You know, what's the tax position going to be after the next budget? Where are we going with all the trade tariffs and so on? So it's much harder to make long-term commitments, which obviously private equity is a medium to long-term commitment, if you are surrounded by so much uncertainty. So I think there is a lot of cash waiting to be deployed, but the will to deploy it is lacking in those that are put off by all of the uncertainties in the geopolitical world at the moment.
You referred at the top of the show to your British pounds. That sort of revealed that you're not actually in the UK now, are you?
No, I've been here in Portugal for 4.5 years. Came here for three reasons, really. More sunshine, less tax, and also it did not escape my attention that this little country on the southern tip of Europe probably would not be the epicenter of World War III. So I figured it was slightly more safe and secure. So no regrets at all. As I sit here watching what's happening in Britain, it's painful. I mean, I still have businesses in Britain, so I'm not completely divorced from the country, but it is frankly shocking to see how far and how fast the UK has come down, and it's scary on a financial and economic level. It's scary on a societal and cultural level, and I witnessed some of that in London last week when I was over there. It's the decline is perhaps more noticeable when you're away and you come back than it is if you're there every day.
How do we get out of this funk then? It's not an easy question to answer, admittedly.
Well, I mean, clearly, I think it's easy just to blame Starmer and Labour, but a lot of the problems
they've been building for a while.
They have, and in fact, most of the problems, I would say, can trace back to Tony Blair. He opened the floodgates to mass immigration, got us into 2 pointless 20-year wars.
Devalued higher education.
Yes, he created all these quangos with almost limitless power and no parliamentary oversight. He did all this stuff with devolution and all the problems that's caused. So I think there's at least 20 years of problems there, and of course the impact of these decisions can take years to materialize. And I think it's only now that the greater British public is starting to understand the impact of unfettered mass immigration, for example. It has taken 20 years, or certainly at least 10 years. And some of the economic impacts, probably you could trace all the way back to Nixon in 1971. So when you see young families not being able to afford to get on the property ladder, that is a direct result of unfettered fiat money for half a century. So, and there's not always the financial and economic literacy to understand that, and I don't think we do a good enough job of educating people to understand that. So a lot of the challenges we're facing today have been 10, 20, 50 years in the making. So I'm not even sure a quick change of government would give us all the answers. I think it needs a more fundamental change in our institutions, in our attitudes, in our culture, in our education. It'll probably take as long to turn around as it's taken to come to this.
Where did your respect for sound money come from? What was this, something that triggered that, or was it what, is it genetic? What do you think? How did you get that?
I think it's a combination of factors. Certainly, I've been conscious of things like gold as a long-term store of value for many years. But I think it's when I realized, and don't forget, I lived through the 1970s, so I know what 20% plus inflation looks like. And many people obviously now are too young to have had that experience. But also, I think seeing not just inflation, but starting to understand about money printing and currency debasement. I think even was it about 100 years ago that Keynes talked about the man in the street not understanding inflation and how it eats away at your wealth. Well, what about currency debasement? Obviously, again, since 1971, currencies have lost, 90+% of their purchasing power. So it was a gradual appreciation of that that made me realize I had to have something. Partly, I think, it was real world assets like property that could maintain that purchasing power, but also gold. And then, I mean, you and I, Tim, have been banging on about this for well over a decade. I'm actually quite surprised at how far down the road we've been able to keep kicking this can of, more and more money printing, more and more debt. I think it's only now since COVID and since the interest rates have somewhat begun to normalize. I mean, people talk as if they're outrageous heights. I had my first mortgage, I think it was 14 point something percent. So I smile when people talk about 4 or 5% as being high interest rates. It's simply the normal price of money across the centuries.
But there is a problem there, isn't there? To the extent that, I mean, I look at the cost of things just in the shops and in the day-to-day world. And I can't see how so many people in London can even afford to live here. If people are clinging on by their fingertips now, then we'll wait till rates go even higher, which they will do.
Indeed, yes, and again, that is partly because of the impact of everything that's happened over the last 50 years. And if you look at the general level of taxation now, even somebody who earns a really good salary, pushing 6 figures a year, their net income is so low, and the costs of rents have obviously gone up after a 10-year vendetta against private landlords started by George Osborne. So now that more and more landlords are selling up, a lot of them are coming into private equity, funnily enough. That's where my biggest source of new members comes from. So as they sell up, the stock of rental properties goes down, the rents are going up, so they're even less affordable. Food inflation, as you know, still north of 5%. And let's be honest, these are official inflation figures, which are the most heavily manipulated of all statistics. So real inflation, probably, if you just double the official numbers, you'll be a lot closer to it. So yeah, it's no surprise people are having to have 2 people working in a household to try and cover the bills. And even then, it's a struggle to save or invest. So I think, did I see the other day, something like 50% of people have less than £1,000 in savings. So these are serious societal issues, and unfortunately what that's going to do is put even more dependency onto government handouts, which is where we're in this kind of doom loop at the moment, that they need to keep raising taxes to cover the handouts, but then the people that are the wealth creators are moving to what I call the Gulch of the 2020s, which is Dubai, and taking all that wealth and tax with them. So, somewhere along the line, we've got to call a halt to this, and we've got to head for lower taxes, lower regulation, more support for business. Now, whether that's Reform and Nigel Farage, I have no idea. I don't see it in either of the other 2 mainstream parties. So, something's got to give.
There's a few lines that come to mind, one of them being that you can vote your way into communism, but you have to shoot your way out.
Ayn Rand, absolutely, yes, that's right. I must be honest, part of me is wondering about that, especially as they're now talking at the Labour Party conference of launching the Brit card, which is, of course, digital serfdom for the population. And When I look back, I remember you, Tim, during the pandemic, you'd always post photos of yourself going to a bar that had stayed open and you were having a pint of beer there, and it seemed like a really kind of edgy thing to be doing. And you think of all the people that were driving around in their cars wearing face masks, they'll be front of queue for the Brit card, thinking, oh, what a great idea, how convenient. And then gradually, of course, that'll turn into digital surveillance, CBDCs, and travel restrictions, etc., with a social credit score. So, the roadmap is clear. But I don't know if there are enough of us that are kind of objecting to it that come at this from perhaps a slightly more libertarian viewpoint. But it is a scary prospect to think where the country will be by the end of this parliament.
It's intriguing, isn't it? Because you can't tell how many people are awake because the media is so heavily censored, and if not, then people are choosing to censor themselves anyway. So it's difficult to know what the truth really is like.
Well, yes. I mean, I think one of the things that people can do, and I've certainly done myself, is to move away from the mainstream media and to look at, some of, I think what they're calling themselves citizen journalists now. But you look at that Tommy Robinson Unite the Kingdom march was a classic example. It barely got any coverage at all. There were probably 1 million people there. The police and the press called it 100,000, and there were 25 troublemakers which they focused on. And yet most of these were there were mums with pushchairs, there were army veterans. These were normal British people, worried about what's happening, but they were kind of radicalized by the media. So I look at people like Dan Wootton or Maya Tusi, people that you can see on YouTube who are recording things as they happen and telling hopefully the truth. You can't rely on the mainstream for that.
I'm not personally not convinced the BBC will ultimately survive what it's done over the last few years. It's shameless betrayal of the people of the UK, I think, is one of the most serious things that's happened since 2020.
Yes, and I think people perhaps just don't realize how far we've turned into China or North Korea. I saw a list of the number of arrests for so-called online offences, and the UK was something like 11 or 12,000. The second on that list was China with about 1,500. So we're 10 times worse than China at arresting people for wrongthink.
Well, it's worse than that if you compare it on a per capita basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. But again, how many people realize this is happening and that you're more likely to get PC Plod knock on your door for a tweet than if you tell them that you've been robbed or raped, and then and yet this apparently is okay. 1% clear-up rate for crime, and in any other industry they'd all be fired. But I think the police need to be decapitated. I think the top 3 layers of management of every constabulary in the country need to be excised to get rid of this cancer.
Well, I wasn't exactly expecting it to be a bed of roses, but you've managed to make me feel suitably sober about prospects for humanity now.
It's difficult because I am a positive person and definitely a glass half full sort of guy. But I just think that
it speaks to the severity of the problem, doesn't it? That
yeah. I mean,
conversations like these.
And also, I think part of it is that I've got some degree of historic perspective. I'll be 70 in February, so I can look back over half a century of adult life, and I can see where things have changed and how badly they've changed. And I think views that were mainstream a decade ago are now referred to as far right. I think if I can paraphrase Sherlock Holmes, when you take away all the other options, I often end up back at conspiracy theory. Even that term itself, I think, was devised by the FBI to try and discredit those who wouldn't buy their story on the Kennedy assassination. So, I think you have to be a critical thinker. You have to look beyond what's in the media. You have to ask more questions and dig deeper to see what's really going on. And it's hard to avoid the idea that there is some kind of world government, WEF type plan that we're not being told about truthfully. But when you look at what's happening, it's about the only way you can rationalize the events of the last 15 or 20 years. So, and that includes things like, the climate catastrophe stuff that's being used for so many agendas. So I think as long as you're a critical thinker, you're aware of these things, you take time to understand them, you can then design your life and still avoid throwing yourself off the nearest multi-story building. There's plenty to be positive about. And I suppose one of the things I'd have to put in there as I think a cause of some of the cultural and societal challenges is the loss of a mainstream faith. For full disclosure, I am a Christian, and I think the decline in Christianity and the rise in immigration from different cultures is a core contributor to the decline of the family, to the decline of core values, to the decline of a common inheritance and a common future. And those things make it much easier for these new ideologies and these new agendas to be spread when there's no kind of glue that's binding you together across the generations.
I mentioned before we started that we have a media picture, and I'm going to get mine in early because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about. And it's a book called COVID-19: Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy. And you can get it for free. We'll put a link to the Springer website where you can download it for free. It's an open access book by a gentleman called David A. Hughes, and he's written on a variety of topics, but this one is available for free. And not to put too fine a point on it, his essential thesis is that World War III has already begun. It began in 2020, and he wasn't joking.
No, indeed, and I think if you look at the cyber attacks we've had recently, that's all part of it. You've got, from a sort of kinetic perspective, you've got Putin has come back from that big military display in China. He seems to be emboldened now. He's been playing around in Polish and Estonian airspace, so he's kind of teasing NATO with Article 5, and then you've got all the things going on in the background, such as the cyber attacks. What's North Korea up to, etc. So there's a lot of that already going on, and I think perhaps they've realized, and I certainly would feel this, that when it comes to Gen Z, if you declared World War III in a traditional sense, I don't think anyone would turn up. I think that they'd demand a health and safety assessment before entering the battlefield. So I think they know that they can't expect a kind of a World War II replay. It's going to be different this time. It's going to be drones. It's going to be robots. It's going to be cyber war. Yeah, psyops as well. But I suppose my biggest concern there is the attitude of the people, because you need strong mental fortitude to deal with this stuff and to come out on the right side of history. So I do think we are led generally by pygmies. We do not have any great visionary leaders in global politics, really. I mean, I think Trump is an interesting character, but we so need some strong leadership to try and get the country and perhaps get Europe back on track. But sadly, it all seems to have been captured, is my impression.
So aside from looking at businesses, do you follow obviously, I'm guessing you follow the markets, but do you have any market outlook opinions, or is that just governed by the sort of projects that come your way?
No, I very definitely follow the markets, and as I say, certainly I would share Tim's views on things like government bonds. It is amazing now that that there's apparently even the UK had an oversubscribed bond auction the other week, which kind of amazed me. But I've developed for these kind of times what I call the barbell philosophy. If you imagine that bunch of people with no social skills in the corner of your gymnasium who lift up and down these heavy weights. I call them grunters. Now, if you just visualize that barbell, so you've got a thin bar that they're holding, and then either end, you've got those great big heavy weights. That's the kind of approach I'm adopting. So at one end of the barbell, I've got all the things that are designed to maintain purchasing power. So that's where I have gold, that's where I have silver, that's where I have real estate, that's where I have commodities, all the things that I think are going to hold value while currencies get debased even further or inflation takes off. And then the thin line, the thin bar, is my small amount of exposure to public stock markets, which generally I think are seriously overvalued. But I do have a little bit of exposure to global markets there. And then at the other end of the big barbell, these are for things that I think can really move the dial. And the bigger your portfolio gets, the more it takes, obviously, to move the dial. I guess, Warren Buffett would be the obvious example of that. And I'm certainly not in that league. But what I have there are things that I think can really make a difference. So that's where my private equity would sit, where I'm looking for, 5x, 10x, 100x returns from getting into the right companies early enough. That's where I would invest in Bitcoin, which would please you, Paul, and things like that. Although I tend to focus more on Bitcoin than on the shit coin, shall we say, which I think are just too volatile for me. So that's the kind of stuff I would put at the other end of the barbell. So things which I think can really make a big difference to the overall outcome. So I'm kind of got minimal exposure to the main public markets. I've got a lot of gold and silver and property, a little bit of commodities, which I'm increasing at the moment. And then I've got a lot of private equity and an increasing amount of Bitcoin. The more it goes up. So that's how I've kind of adapted my own asset allocation to meet the challenges of the 2020s.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, just to clarify for people who don't know what Tim's view on bonds is, so for somebody who's listening to this for the first time, you said you share his view, but so do you just want to state what your view is on bonds? I'm guessing bonds in general.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when Tim and I suppose myself as well first started saying that, we were in the days of zero interest rates, so it was very easy to say it was a return-free risk. But even now, 4 or 5%, I just feel that whilst it may for some people make them a little bit more attractive than equity risks, I just on the whole feel that there's going to be such a reckoning coming that I don't really feel the need to expose capital for such a modest return. Because if you accept that real inflation is at least 5 or 6%, and there's currency debasement on top of that, if they start money printing again, generally I think you need to look at a double-digit return to stand still, and more than double digits to get ahead. So for me, even at 5%. I'm still losing money, and I think I'm taking an enormous risk with my capital, because one of the things that didn't really get much publicity around the time of the whole Liz Truss thing was how much pension funds lost by having loads of bonds they'd bought at very low interest rates, and as rates started going up, the capital value of those older bonds, of course, goes down, and so the pension funds and indeed the Bank of England sitting on huge unrealized losses on the bonds they bought in those zero interest days after the GFC. So people forget it's not just about the yield; it's about whether you get your capital back and how much of it you get back.
You're absolutely right. And people are unaware of the damage that bonds can inflict on a portfolio, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that's lived through the 70s, because the same thing happened then. But there's a 50-year inflation-linked gilt UK government bond. The year of that culminated in the sort of short-lived Liz Truss administration, and she gets a bad rap, I think. So I think it was stitched up by various deep state forces, but that year, between January and the time she was defenestrated, the price of the 50-year inflation-linked gilt fell by 85%. That's the risk-free rate.
Yeah, exactly. And then there was that Austrian 100-year one as well, wasn't there? That has had a similar fate. But yeah, I agree that I think Liz Truss was trying to do the right things, and was the first leader for decades to do so. But yeah, I think Andrew Bailey takes a lot of the blame, and he knew about those LDIs that were hidden in pension funds, did nothing about them, and then threw her under the bus. But what else do you expect from him? I think it's if there's something we could copy from Donald Trump, it would be to get rid of the head of the central bank in the UK.
Absolutely. And the other thing is that not just the central banks are the enemy, but we had an Austrian school professor on several years ago now, Guido Hulsmann, who teaches in France. And the first time we had him on the show, he surprised me because I asked him if he could change one thing about the system, what would it be? And I was expecting him to talk about something monetary, and his answer was get government out of education. Which the more I think about it, the more is he's absolutely right. So you've got this endemic rot everywhere throughout the establishment, but the place to start is in the schools. Because if you don't teach people about money and finance and saving in the real world, you can't expect people to be aware of these issues later on in life when they're actually earning.
Well, no, absolutely. And one of the people I interviewed on my own podcast was Tal Stefani, who runs the Ayn Rand Institute in America. And they basically raise funds from their members to buy copies of her books to distribute in schools and colleges. And I thought that was a great way of doing that, because, yeah, you've got to get this into the schools, obviously starting, I guess, with some of the staff. And we're talking there about a 50-year process of moving to the left and wokery and all the rest of it. Again, not going to be an overnight fix. Although, to be fair, the universities now are really struggling. I don't know if you saw Oxford and Cambridge no longer in the top 3. They're financially challenged because there are fewer overseas students coming. So they are in deep trouble. And I think a lot of the impact of AI will be on education as well, because when all the world's knowledge is available to everybody for free, where does that leave the role of school and university? So there's some quite big challenges facing the education sector generally, but I certainly agree that their approach, their way of thinking, and the way they've been captured needs to be turned around if we're going to rescue society as well as the economy.
The whole of the schooling system was pretty much designed for factory workers. The way the bell rings, you go from class to class, and the way the subjects are taught, they kind of not put together all sort of hodgepodge changes. Instead of just doing a day of English or a day of maths or whatever it might be, they're kind of split up. It's kind of designed. It was designed for a different era, and
a school's ultimately just a prison with worse food.
I think the redeeming factor is the social aspect of it. I think it's important for people to get out and meet other people, to be in society, to have sort of arguments, to meet people that you disagree with, and to be able to kind of move forward and to see all different flavors of colors of life, as it were. To have I think schools, that element of school is very important, but what's been actually taught, as we know, doesn't necessarily help you in life. And there's so many really important things that you need to learn, and for some reason, whether it's by design or whatever, but it's probably most likely by design, it doesn't work like that. And I think also one of the problems with the education system is if you're trying to teach younger people, especially, you Graham, you must know younger people in your family that perhaps want, who you want to give advice to, is they don't necessarily look that way for information, because the double-edged sword of everything being online is they think they can find it out themselves, or they're getting it from some TikTok commentator or whatever it might be. And it's this breaking down of information into small bites when things need to be discussed over a longer period, which is, I think, why podcasts have been so great, to be able to sort of extend and talk about a subject and go into lots of detail, whereas beforehand you wouldn't get that long form discussion, and hear the nuances of things. So I think the social aspect is really important. I'm sure university for you, Tim, was great fun, or I'm hoping it would be, and a really important part of life. But I didn't actually go to university, and the only aspect of it that I regret would be the amount of fun that you could have at university. It's sort of your final time to kind of enjoy yourself,
behave irresponsibly,
and make contacts. People, if somebody contacts you from university or from school, even I've got friends going back to my primary school who I'm still in contact with, and if they were saying something like, I'm going to set up a business, you'd be like, yeah, great. You'd want to help them immediately because you have that connection, which doesn't seem to. If you can't form that online. It's like this human thing, and that's why I'm very optimistic about AI in the sense that it's a good tool, but I think we just still crave human interaction, and we always will.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think there's several really important points you bring up there. And I think don't just apply in the education system. I think they apply across society. And if you think about it, there are far fewer face-to-face interactions in our everyday lives now. You have the self-service petrol stations, self-service supermarkets, banks, etc. So gradually, technology has removed the need to talk to other people. AI will take that a whole stage further. So I think what will then become valuable, because one of the questions I often ask of parents today is, what on earth do you do in terms of career advice to your children in an age where people like lawyers and doctors are being replaced by AI? And I think the answer is that human empathy will become a really important skill. And whether that's in a business sense, that could be a sales function. It could be in a social sense. Obviously, it's when you meet people. So I think those interpersonal experiences and skills will become really sought after. And I think the equivalent of this might be, say, for example, that we enjoy going to a live music concert. Even rather than just watching something on a screen, being there live will become a really important part of life. So I think it's important that we continue and find ways to continue those kind of social skills. And if you look at the latest book by Neil Howe, who originally co-authored The Fourth Turning, he's written a new one saying this is the fourth turning, and in that he tries to talk about what can we do about all the problems that are facing us in what they call the crisis era. And a lot of it is about social, local contact. It's about becoming more engaged. One of the things I've noticed since my kind of baby boomer generation is starting to die out, a lot of these membership groups, anything from the Women's Institute to the Rotary Club or whatever, they're desperately running out of members because people don't join things anymore. So one of the ways in which Howe talks about reviving society is to get involved at a local level. That could be standing as a councillor. It could be just joining clubs and organisations in the community. It could be your local church. But that's one of the ways in which I think we need to try and get more human interaction. And the other side, I guess, would be to reinforce the family. And I think there are things that governments can do with tax incentives and all the rest of it to reinforce family life as well, because these are the bedrocks of a stable multi-generational society that we seem to have allowed to be eroded.
Tim's recommendation of reading the book *Sapiens* opened my eyes to the way that the governments actually have a desire to separate the family in a way that a child, as a child grows up and looks for support, they want that support to come from the government, not from the family, to kind of create that separation. And it's really fascinating when you look at it, at how that works. There aren't the incentives towards keeping the family. There are more incentives to be more reliant on the government. And again, whether that's just misguided policy or whether it's by design, it is open to debate, but it's definitely there.
Yes, and I mean, I think we've seen this incredible situation where teenagers can make major decisions about their gender and surgery and so on without even the school needing to talk to the parents about it. These things are ludicrous and should be illegal.
Well, I think there's a word for it, and I think that word is evil. So I think one of the things, particularly from the David Day Hughes book, is that he's coined this term omniwar to try and explain what's going on, but it's happening across multiple disciplines simultaneously. And I suspect you'd have some sympathy for the view that part of it has a spiritual aspect, that this is literally good versus evil.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We are in a battle, and that's something that Christians acknowledge that is happening now. I mean, to be honest, I came to faith relatively late in life. I used to think all this just happened when you die, and you either went upstairs or downstairs. But what I now know is it's actually going on here and now. And I think in some ways, it feels a bit like the end times that, things couldn't get much worse in many respects. So it's a real challenge. But if you don't have that shared bedrock of faith, then I think it does become easier to divide and conquer, and that is what successive governments have done. I think it's difficult to know exactly how much of it is being manipulated from on high, but there's definitely there are forces that we did not vote for or stand for election who seem to be manipulating our daily lives in a way that is not for our benefit. And I definitely believe if you look at the current government, for example, it seems to me like they almost loathe and detest us. They don't really like us. They don't want to help us. They're not there for human flourishing. They're just there to turn us from citizens into serfs.
The optimist in me takes solace in linguistics, because I used to think that the phrases or the words apocalypse and Armageddon were synonymous, but that's not the case. That the origin, you may well know this, the origin of the word apocalypse is the Greek for unveiling or unmasking. So what we're actually seeing what we're effectively experiencing is a great reveal, and it's like, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Indeed, yes. Then you read back to things like the Club of Rome back in the 1970s issuing a report saying, let's use the climate as a way of getting everyone on board to our plans, so we can create a fear about climate change and all the rest of it. And I've spoken to professors who've told me, look, we're actually in a long-term period of global cooling that has a very short-term uptick in warming, but thousands of top professors have said there is no climate crisis. But if you say it loud enough and often enough, sadly, you can get a majority of people to believe you and do very silly things like net zero and Mr. Miliband and his mission. So we now end up with the most expensive energy in the world and deindustrializing on a rapid scale. So sooner or later you just wish that the grown-ups would take over from the lunatics, but I'm not quite sure how we make that happen.
Because you raise an interesting point, and it's one that we've discussed, I'm sure, multiple times on the show. And the analogy I'd make is, things were pretty bad in the 70s. I'm not, I was a young child during the 70s, but I can remember, for me, it was mostly the fashions and the colours that were so dreadful. So having lived through flares the first time, I can't see how they've managed possibly to re-arrive, but they have. I suppose it's, if you weren't there to experience the full horror of these things, then you're that much more susceptible to repeating them after the fact. But I remember that the fashions and the colours, avocado, green, orange, brown,
collars, like, big collars.
Humanity lost its senses. But the serious point I'm trying to make is that I dare say around sort of 76, and we had the IMF emergency loan of the laughably small amount of $3.9 billion, which at the time was the largest loan that ever extended, apparently. It seemed pretty bleak. And then Thatcher arrived. So I guess the point I'm trying to get to is, we just don't know what that Mrs. Thatcher looks like today, because no one's heard of her. It might be Nigel Farage, it might be somebody else, but until they make themselves known, you kind of assume there's a vacuum out there.
Yeah, and I think history has a habit of producing the right person at the right time. Think back, I suppose, to Churchill and the war years, and he had a fairly checkered career before that. And Thatcher was, let's be honest, an unlikely savior if you looked at the early days of her career, and yet she turned into just what the country needed. So yeah, we have to hope there's somebody out there, but at the moment I can't even see the political structure that would deliver that, because if you have a divided right, let's say, with the Tories and Reform, somewhat divided left, even Jeremy Corbyn's party of three people seems to already have three different factions in it.
It's like something out of Monty Python, isn't it? The Life of Brian and the multiple Palestinian fringe groups.
Yeah. So yeah, it is at the moment. maybe this is the darkness before the dawn. I do suspect, and this again is a replay of the 70s, that things have to get worse before they get better. And I think that we haven't reached bottom yet. I think there is, and maybe this November's budget will be the catalyst for that. But I think once things get really bad over the next 2 or 3 years, by the end of this parliament, there will be such an appetite for change that a radical new leader, possibly a radical new party, could actually go from zero to majority government, even in a first past the post system. So I think we have to cling to that hope. But at the moment, it seems to me that free speech in Britain seems to rely more on the American vice president than on any of our own elected representatives. So, this is a pretty dark place to be as an outsider looking into what's going on in Great Britain.
Well, there's a line I like to use from Lily Tomlin, which is things are going to get a lot worse before they get worse.
Yeah. I think there's another line of hers, something about I try to be cynical, but sometimes it's hard to keep up.
It's impossible to keep up, exactly.
Yeah. So I think we all. I suppose obviously we have a somewhat of a financial bias on this broadcast. So I think it's important to say to people, you've almost got to try and rise above all this and become sort of sovereign of your own portfolio, your own wealth, your own net worth, and your family's position. And you've got to try and create multi-generational wealth against this backdrop. And that's why, I talk about things like wealth preservation through, precious metals, property, etc. You've got to try and create things that are not capable of being destroyed. But also you've got to bear in mind, this is why I also talk a lot about becoming a global citizen. You've got to be able to avoid the scenario that even in America, who'd have ever thought in the land of the free and the home of the brave that they would make owning gold illegal for 40 years? So you've got to recognize you've got to have some assets in a different country. That's why, I like having my gold in Zurich. I've also got gold and silver in Singapore. I've got properties overseas. I've deliberately tried to design things so that they could not be confiscated by a single government. And you have to start thinking in these sort of terms if you want to create something that is sustainable across the generations and cannot be, and that's another reason for investing in Bitcoin. I don't want something that can be confiscated or debased by a government or a political party. I want something that's an independent global asset. So you can't be too paranoid, you can't be too careful, but you've got to plan this. This won't happen by osmosis. You've got to sit down and say, where are all my current assets? What's my exposure to geopolitics? What's my exposure to inflation and currency debasement? And what changes do I need to make as of today to start putting myself on a firmer footing for my own sake, my retirement, my children, my grandchildren, and so on. So I think there's a real piece of important research and homework for people to do. Don't just sit back like the majority and be buffeted by events. It's much better to be a year early than a day late. So, for example, from my own background, in 2018, when it looked seriously like we could have Jeremy Corbyn leading a Marxist government at the next election, I bought property in Montenegro and got residency there ahead of that election, which then Boris surprised us by winning it and then disappointed us by turning out to be a great campaigner and a hopeless prime minister. But I'd already got my retaliation in first, and I was ready for that. And again today, obviously, I then went from there to Portugal. So you've got to start thinking like a global citizen. You've got to start taking action. And these things change constantly. The scheme that brought me to Portugal is no longer available. So you have to be on top of these changes and work out what's best for you at a given point in time, and be ready to take action, because these things will not be around forever, and who knows if there'll be an American-style exit tax in the next budget. So be very careful, be paranoid, and start planning now as a global citizen.
Familiarity with history helps, so anyone that's loosely aware of what happened in the 70s will have benefited from that, because history seems to be repeating itself.
Indeed, and of course that is definitely one of the messages from the fourth turning, that you can look at those sort of 80-year cycles, and that gives you one kind of framework in which to operate. And I think that does help because we're bombarded with so much information, so much contradictory information, that having a way of putting things into some kind of structure and framework is really helpful. So I think we know that we're in a period of upheaval. You can see the loss of trust in the big institutions and so on. We've been here somewhat before in the 70s. We've got a spendthrift government that could easily run out of cash. So what do you do in those circumstances? Well, look what happened with gold. Peaked in 1980, and then obviously it's retrenched and it's gone back up again. But people say to me, "Oh, isn't it great that the gold price is going up so much?" I say, "Well, not really. What gold isn't changing at all. It's just that the pound and the dollar are going down so much." And you look at your shopping basket for another view on that. So I think it's hard for people to realize just how much value gets lost in these fiat currencies. And so the first step of your plan is how to hang on to wealth, and gold is a key part of that. And then obviously it's how you could increase your wealth, which is where you start looking at some of the other things I've talked about, whether that's Bitcoin, private equity, or whatever. But the chances are, if you do what everyone else does, you're going to get the same result as them. And I fear that a lot of people are going to be badly impacted by events both in the public stock markets and bond markets, and more generally in the whole kind of geopolitical sphere across the rest of this decade. There's going to be an awful lot of change, not all of it in any way predictable. And if you look already at de-dollarization and the move towards a bipolar world, if you like, with China and the BRICS countries versus the West, will that end up in a shooting war? Quite possibly. What would one of the questions I posed in my own newsletter last week was, if some version of the flu was enough to empty supermarket shelves, what do you think the sound of gunfire or drones across London and the southeast will do? So, how well resourced are you if that happened? Have you got cash? Have you got food? Have you got water? Have you got ammunition? So these are questions that should not be dodged. We should at least have some kind of idea of where we would go and what we would do if things did get significantly worse. And people tend not to want to think about that, but it is something that I think should be on the agenda.
I'm reading Dominic Frisby's latest book, The Secret History of Gold, and I haven't got to it yet, but at the launch, he alluded to this stat, or on a recent podcast, he alluded to this stat, which is that I think I'm right in this. He got the basically UK median wages going back to 2000, so it was 2000 to 2024, as expressed in gold. So if you started with UK median wages at 100 as priced in gold back in 2000, what do you think they are? What the level is that they're at now, roughly?
Yeah, and people are worse off significantly, aren't they?
It's 25. So in real terms, or in gold real terms, people have lost 75% of their wealth in the last 25 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a real shocker.
Yeah, and the same is true. Obviously, people have this wealth effect on the other side of that coin through their property. They think because their house is worth so much more than they paid for it in fiat terms, they think they're wealthy. But if you price when they bought it in gold and what it's worth now in gold, they get a very different picture. So gold is real and everything else is fake. So you can really only use the value based on gold to tell you whether you've progressed or regressed over a period of time. And sadly, in many cases, at least with property, you've stood still. And even I did the same with the S&P 500. And if you look at that if you map it against currency debasement and inflation, it's almost a straight line match. So you've kept pace with it, but you're not any further ahead now than you were 10 years ago because of that loss of currency value.
How concerned are you about the successful launch of CBDCs, central bank digital currencies?
It's a real worry because I can imagine them being positioned as very convenient. I can imagine Joe Public being bribed with 100 free Brit pounds. especially when you sign up for your Brit card. So yeah, I can see the mass of the population being fooled by it, and I can see a bunch of us, maybe it's 10% of the population, who would not want to play that game. What I don't know is how heavy-handed they'll become, because I just saw a stat from Vietnam that
They've
they
just
have.
closed 80 million bank accounts.
You stole my thunder. There you go. And that was because they refused to do the whole kind of digital ID, biometric ID thing. So, yeah, I mean,
Well,
what
they
happened?
tried it in Nigeria, and then they ended up burning the banks down in the street. So I'd like to think that that enough Brits will do the right thing, and hopefully peaceably. But there'll be lots of passive resistance.
Exactly. That is all we can do, and even to the point of relocating. And I think we're almost at this fight or flight stage now. I've chosen flight, but yeah, I would hope that there'd be sufficient pushback politically, and also ultimately, this is why I was so impressed with the Unite the Kingdom thing. You've got to get people off their sofas and onto the streets. I don't know if you remember, the only time I ever saw Tony Blair look frightened was when the petrol tanker drivers went on strike at a time when there was no fuel reserves in the country. So you can remind politicians who holds the power, and it is although they're in charge of the armed forces and so on, there's an awful lot that citizens can do to peacefully protest. And I think it will come to that as we see more and more of our freedoms being eroded, both online through the Online Safety Act, again under the supposed auspices of child protection. We've now got the Brit card supposedly to deal with illegal immigration, which of course it won't touch at all. So I'm hoping enough people will see through these lies that there'll be some resistance and that they won't get away with it. But on the evidence of how people behaved during the pandemic, it's frankly hard to be optimistic.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that you looking at Bitcoin would please me. I have to say I'm kind of agnostic on any market. It's just a question of, I can see the value in these things. I can see the value in the technology. I can see how that's not understood and how it's being adopted. But you mentioned the word paranoia, and perhaps I would describe my paranoia with any investment, any market, being that it can change at any point. Like, yes, the government can then decide that they want to confiscate your gold. Yes, they can decide that, okay, they might not be able to physically take your Bitcoin, but they might make it illegal to trade in Bitcoin. And or it may just, there may be a technology that comes along and usurps it, and there are other things around there that are vying for this competition because the prize is so big, or it may just continue to a million, as some people think. So if you look at the beginning of the internet and how many companies were forming, and then we got this boom in 2000 where companies that effectively were just riding that wave of money and using .com in order to just cash in pretty much. When it all shook out, we ended up with the internet and world-changing companies like Amazon and later on Netflix, but Facebook and eBay and all these different technologies. So there will be a similar culling when it comes to cryptocurrencies, because it is technology, it is new technology. But quite which ones are definitely going to win? You could say Bitcoin is most likely, and it seems to be most likely. But all I'm trying to say here is that I think you can only, as part of what you were saying, what people should do, I always think you're always in a moment of time where you can only judge things as of now and then try and project a small distance into the future. Because there was an expression about companies, and it said, if the rate of change outside of the company is faster than the rate of change inside the company, you've got a problem. And I think that applies to markets. If the rate of change of the market sentiment is faster than your ability to spot it, then you're going to get caught out. So whilst I'm technical, and I think I like the way the technicals seem to discount a lot of things before people talk about them, in the same way that there's a lot of negativity about the markets being too high, and especially in the UK. But the UK market is at an all-time high, even though the news seems to be really negative. Now, if you were an investor and you were following the news, you'd stay out of the market. But that market's been doing okay. So how do you square that circle? Where is the disinformation there? And I'm not saying that it's not, that it's going to keep going up forever and it's absolutely fine to shut your eyes. There will be a big correction for sure, but it's also important to look at where the disparities are, i.e., the kind of inverted commas overvaluation has been going on for some time, and it's still going up.
Well, gosh, there's quite a lot in there to unpack. I think one of the key developments in recent years that's impacting all this is the growth of passive investing, because passive investing is always going to reinforce the status quo. So every time new money comes in, they're buying, more Apple, more of the rest of the Mag 7, because that's what they've got to do in their remit. And so you're reinforcing the current situation, and also even the inventor of passive, John Bogle, never expected it to be more than 20% of the market. Well, now it's the majority of the market. So if everyone goes passive, who's on the other side of the trade, and how do we ever have price discovery? So there's a definite danger of overpaying through passivity, if you like. But equally, of course, the old chestnut is that a lot of active managers fail to beat the market anyway. So why bother? Clearly the whole ethos of investing is knowing when to buy and when to sell, and that's no different with crypto or with public stock markets. With private equity, it's harder because you have fewer opportunities to exit. So that has to be a decision you're comfortable with for a longer period of time. If you look at, say, Tim's area of value investing, that went through quite a long period of doldrums when everyone was into growth, and now suddenly it's turned and it's value investing that's growing. Now, if you'd been familiar with Tim's work, you'd have got onto that value train perhaps nice and early, and you'd be benefiting from the growth that's going on now. But one of the problems is, people are not just choosing passive funds, they're choosing a passive mindset with their portfolio. So, for example, very few people know what their pensions are invested in. And often it's some very mediocre general fund that's barely covering its costs. So, people do need to become active managers of their investments, even if some of them are passive choices of ETFs and so on. So I think the thing I always say is that nobody else woke up this morning with your financial well-being at the top of their agenda. The only person who cares about it is that, Adonis or that babe looking back at you in the bathroom mirror. So, you've got to take ownership of this. You've got to make some decisions, even if you have advisors, even if you have, fund managers. You've got to look at this and see if you're in the right place at the right time, and try to get more of these decisions right than you get wrong. But if the professionals make plenty of mistakes as well, so you can't expect perfection, but you should be on top of it. You should know, even if it's just in an Excel spreadsheet, you should know all of your assets, and you should review them at least on a quarterly basis and see what's happening in those sectors and whether you still want to be there or not. Obviously, diversification comes into this, possibly rebalancing, all the traditional kind of portfolio management methods. But what you have to start with, and what many people fail to do, is to take ownership and to say, look, this is my financial future. It's my children's financial future. I'm going to spend some time actively on top of this and making decisions that I think are right based on the information I have today.
Great stuff. I think that's what do you think, Tim? Any more questions, or should we go?
No, that was a mic drop moment, wasn't it?
I think it was. Yeah, indeed. Graham, as Tim mentioned, Well, Tim, you've given out your media pick, haven't you?
Yeah, so I'm going to have, so I've chosen mine already, which is this book by David A. Hughes, COVID-19, Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy. It's a puckish satire on contemporary mores.
Fantastic.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I'd probably go back to one we already quoted from, which is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, because I feel we need to celebrate the wealth creators a lot more than we are doing at the moment. And it is not easy to build successful businesses. And when you see what this government is doing to get in the way, you can see why they're all heading off to Galt's Gulch in Dubai. So I would go for Atlas Shrugged.
Just before I say mine, I just wanted to make a comment about some people think that what we have at the moment is normal capitalism, and you're either on the left or the right. But would you agree that the crony capitalism is what's causing a lot of the problems that we have at the moment, not allowing smaller companies to flourish, keeping that kind of ceiling by which companies can't grow over due to regulation and over-regulation? Do you think that is a problem?
Absolutely, yes. And clearly we have this situation where corporations are becoming more powerful than governments. I mean, the obvious one would be BlackRock, whose chief is now also running the WEF. So what could possibly go wrong there? Yeah. So I mean, a great example of that was the whole ESG bollocks. I mean, that it got to the point where they were more or less saying, if you don't buy into this ESG and climate catastrophe stuff, we'll stop funding you. And that amount of power is very, very unhealthy in a supposedly capitalist system. So I think
happily in America, the market told them to get lost.
Eventually, yes, that's right, and this is what we need. So on the one hand, I have huge admiration for people like Elon Musk who've built enormous businesses that are changing the world. But there are other Elon Musks. I just did an interview with a guy called Jeremy Middleton who co-founded HomeServe, which they spent 30 years building it, just sold it a couple of years ago for over £4 billion. So a rare example of a British unicorn that went the whole way. But yeah, there are loads of great entrepreneurs in Britain. There are loads of great capitalists. But we need to have an environment that encourages them, allows them to grow, gives them more of the rewards for growing. The incentives for entrepreneurs have been cut back enormously in recent years. The entrepreneur relief when they sell, the dividend allowances, and so on. It's really very hard to grow businesses in the UK. That's why so many are leaving for America. But yeah, a genuine capitalist culture. And also, to be honest, we need an equity owning culture. We had this back in the 80s with all the big privatizations, and the man in the street was buying equities and going into, I think they were called PEPs, personal equity plans at the time.
Yeah, I remember
now
this.
ISAs. Well, now very few members of the public buy stocks and shares. Very few actual retail investors even buy gold. It's the central banks that are buying most of it. So we and I include the three of us on this broadcast have a duty and a piece of work to do to spread the news to invest more in capitalism, because it's the core of the wealth and the standard of living we enjoy in the West. It is being eroded by government, by global agendas, and by crony capitalism. And we need to get back to real, genuine capitalism, because that is the only thing that creates real wealth and improves living standards.
Another mic drop moment there. We had Luke Johnson on our 100th pod, which was fantastic. I bought his book, Start It Up, and I haven't read it, which is a bit naughty. I should, but there's what it's like having a lot of books to read. But that was I love the idea of businesses. It's really fascinating how an idea can go from a German idea to a big company and etc. But yeah, definitely the government needs to do more to help it. And I guess it's not surprising that they don't help it, because they don't come from that background. They come from a very different background where they don't really understand what a business have to deal with in terms of trying to get something off the ground. and they come from a rules-based system where you do X, Y, and Z, and you get this result, and that's not how businesses work.
Well, I suspect there's not a single entrepreneur in the Parliamentary Labour Party, and that sort of speaks volumes. So these people are just not the entrepreneurial class.
No, exactly. They're all public sector background or Resolution Foundation think tanks with their soak the rich mentality, So it certainly isn't going to, everything we're looking to have happen is not going to happen under this government. I think we can write off the next few years. Whether the Parliament goes its full length or not, obviously, I don't know. But I do just want to mention one slightly amusing thing because it just happened to me. I have on my bookshelf in front of me a book called The War on Cash, written by some...
Oh, don't believe a word of it.
Oh, I don't know. No, that's been debunked.
Some obscure writer.
Yeah,
Well, I was
never heard of
traveling
him.
I was traveling on an EasyJet plane coming back to Portugal, and for years they've proudly boasted that they are a cash-free airline. Well, on this flight, they suddenly had a problem with their credit card terminals, and so everyone's ordering all this food off the buffet, and all their cards are being declined, and eventually they come over the tannoy saying, "Does anyone have Apple Pay? Because that's the only thing that's working at the moment." And I said to them, "I've got some cash," and they said, "It's not company policy, sir." I thought, yeah, they're having to give the stuff away because they will no longer accept cash. But there you go.
Amazing. So just in case people missed the reference there, Tim Price wrote that book. So we should put a link to that as well.
Yeah, we'll happily do that.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'll just quickly give you my media. Do you think it's too many, Tim?
No, go for it. It has to be an embarras de richesse or nothing, Paul.
Okay, well, yeah, this is going to be whatever you just said there.
Embarras de richesse.
Yes, indeed.
An embarrassment of riches.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was about to say. Thank you, Tim. Right, I've got two. So one is, if you like your horrors, I don't know if you've seen Weapons. Fantastic.
I've seen the trailer for it.
Oh, it's very good. Very good film. I highly recommend it. So the plot is, when all but one child from the same class mysteriously vanish on the same night at exactly the same time, a community is left questioning who or what was behind their disappearance. So
Keir Starmer.
No. World Economic Forum.
So there's that, and something which has been around for a while, which I hadn't seen, and it's very much English, I think, style humour. So I will preface it, and that's why I think it will work in this particular environment. Is something called Plebs. It's a series that's on Netflix, but on ITVX if you can get it. It's, if you like Friday Night Dinner, you'll really like it. It's basically set in Rome, but kind of modern day characters set in Rome, and it's very, very funny. These two guys, and they've got a slave called Grumio, and it's like they're dealing with sort of problems of the time, their job, their boss, and all that sort of stuff, but in a kind of modern way, but set in Rome. It's just very, very funny.
Frankie Howard did something similar about in Rome, I seem to remember.
Oh, yes.
Pompeii.
Pompeii, yes.
I remember because I was at my grandma's house, and I kept badgering my mum to tell me I wanted to, there was a thing called Up the Chastity Belt, and I said, "What's a chastity belt?" And I never got a satisfactory answer.
Brilliant.
No. Your deprived childhood coming out now.
I know, it's first world problems, really.
Yeah,
I'd like to think I've been able to deal with it over time.
Those and the flares, Tim,
Yeah, and the bathrooms.
I do have a photo of myself with shoulder-length hair and a stripy tank top, so it's under lock and key at the moment. I'm not going to.
I was going to say, are we going to get a link to it? So
No, you're not.
No,
Absolutely
okay,
not.
that's a shame.
What's it worth to suppress this information?
Let's negotiate. There's a brown on.
It just goes to show everybody has compromat.
That's how I got captured anyway. I don't know what your story is.
So, Graham, how can people get hold of you, or where are you? What are your handles?
My handles are, well, if you're into investing, there's insideinvestorclub.com. That's our private members club. If you're a founder looking to raise money, there's foundercapitalraise.com. Or you can find me on Substack. My newsletter's called Escape Velocity. I write about business, investing, and how to escape. Or you can just connect with me on LinkedIn.
Fantastic.
If you want to send us some links, we can include those in the show notes, Graham.
Perfect. Okay, will do.
Brilliant. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you, Graham. It's been really, really good. And
thank you very much. Thanks, guys. I really enjoyed it.
Wish you all the best with your projects.
And let's face it, the food in Portugal is not bad either, is it?
It's definitely a step up. The food, the wine, the weather. I would thoroughly recommend it. So get your bags packed and your passports ready, and we'll see you over here.
Whereabouts are you?
Party, Graham's house, Sunday.
North or south?
Villamora in the Central Algarve.
Oh, very nice. Right. Okay. Excellent.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's an open invitation. Let me know when you're coming.
Well, you might just hear a knock at the door one day, and you'll be like,
it won't be the secret police.
Yeah, no, I've not posted anything controversial recently, so I should be safe for a little while anyway.
Yeah, cool. Brilliant stuff. Thanks again, Graham. Take care, and look forward to having you back.
Thanks a lot. Cheers, guys. All the best.
Thanks, Graham.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Please do your own research or contact a professional advisor.